Oh. And welcome to the online network of independent learning professionals. We are going to be chatting with Christy Tucker today, the queen of branching scenarios. And she's going to be talking about how we can streamline branching scenario planning and design processes. Lots and lots of really good stuff in this session. I'm very excited to jump in with her. Christy's part of the community. She's incredible at all things e-learning. If you've not been to her website, she's at cineadlearning.com. And I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And that way you can share your screen, Christy, if you've got slides, and then maybe tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and we can jump right in.
All right. So let me, you know what? Need to hit the share screen on Zoom before I get into full screen mode on my presentation. We're going to do this in the correct order.
There we go. And yeah, so I see right now your process. And now, yep, now I see your first.
There you go. Do you see the slide now? Full screen?
Yep.
All right, great.
Full screen. Perfect.
All right. So my name is Christy Tucker, and I love branching scenarios. They are my favorite thing to do. And so I write about branching scenarios. I've been doing e-learning, online learning since 2004, so 15 years now. And this is the stuff that I have the most fun creating. And so over the years, I have figured out some ways to make branching scenarios a little bit more manageable. They're always going to be complex, kind of no matter what you do, but we can at least make it a little bit more manageable with some tips that I've got here. So I have a lot of tips to share today. So this is about the process for the planning and design for branching scenarios. That is the analysis, the planning. We're going to look at branching structures and the different ways that you can structure these scenarios in order to make things a little easier on yourself. We're going to look at the open source tool Twine, which I use for drafting and creating prototypes. We're going to talk about writing, and then that gets us to the point of having a functional prototype built in Twine that you can give to your SMEs and your stakeholders for review. And there's going to be a lot of content in here, but my hope is that everybody should get at least one or two things that you can use to make your life a little easier. What this presentation is not is about development. This is, I've already got a lot in here, and I decided that I just can't get all of the development tool tricks in here as well. But so this won't be anything about that development. So what the good news is you'll get to the point of a prototype, and then you can go build it in whatever tool it is that you're going to use. But we're not going to talk about the actual development piece of it in this presentation today. So let's start with analysis and planning. So the first step for doing presentations is to begin with the end in mind. Instead of thinking about what should people know, think about what should people do. What do we want them to do differently after they complete this scenario? Whether this is for practice or assessment, what is it that we want their behavior change to be? Kathy Moore has been beating this drum for years. This is a thing that she talks about a lot, of focusing on what we need to do instead of what we need to know. So branching scenarios are not a good choice. If all you're going to do is increase awareness, there are much easier ways to do it than doing branching scenarios. So one way to think about the behaviors, Julie Dirksen describes it as the photo test. And if you took a photo or a video of the desired behavior, what would it look like? So you might talk to a client and they might say, oh, we need training on quality customer service. So part of your analysis has to be to figure out what quality customer service really looks like. You can't just get sort of that list of principles or the broad best practices. You need really specific examples and what to look for. So maybe quality customer service maybe means that the cashiers are asking customers if they found everything that they were looking for, and then calling for someone to help if the customer missed something. That's a specific behavior that we can observe and assess. So think about the photo test when you're talking to your SMEs, talking to your clients to get things. If the client says, oh, we need something on better communication between nurses and patients, that again is really broad. That's a hard thing to measure because it's so broad. So maybe we want to specifically say we're looking for open-ended, that they should ask open-ended questions to learn what concerns are most important to the patient. That again is a behavior that we can observe and assess, and we can specifically put into a branching scenario. So I'm going to do this as my objective. Some of you who read my blog have maybe seen the branching scenario where I talk about how to screen clients, and that we're going to use as the example through this. So the big objective on this is that instructional designers are going to screen clients by using a repeatable process and asking probing questions. Technically, that's probably, you can make an argument that that's two objectives, but probing questions is part of that process. So you're talking to your SMEs, you figure out your objective like this. Next in the analysis, we need to identify the mistakes. So what are the common mistakes that people make? And where do people get stuck in this process? This is a really critical step when you're planning for a branching scenario, because a lot of times when we talk to the SMEs, what we get is just the ideal behavior, the goal of the desired behavior, and they don't necessarily give us the examples of the mistakes and the failures. But that's exactly what we need for branching. You need to know what the wrong behavior looks like. So in an ideal world, we'd all have access to learners and people who have recently learned the skills so that we could ask them and not just the SMEs. So when you can, great, but at least ask the SMEs where people get stuck, where they get confused. All of these mistakes that you identify in this planning, this is what is going to become the distractors and the wrong paths in your branching scenario. The mistakes, knowing where people get stuck, also helps you determine what needs to be a decision point in the branching scenario. The decision point is any point where you make them make a choice. So if certain parts of the process are fairly clear and unproblematic, then we'll talk about later that you can skip through those fairly quickly. They can be sort of a passive review. We're going to talk about cutscenes later. But the mistakes help you identify what is it that people are going to need to do in order to meet the objectives in the scenario. Following from that, for every mistake that you identify, you have to figure out the consequences. So you're going to ask your SMEs and your sources about what are the consequences if people make this mistake. And those consequences become the feedback in the scenario. So if it's that customer service one, forgetting to ask the customers if they found everything results in lost sales and less satisfied customers. Asking a patient a closed question rather than an open-ended one results in a one-word answer. That's the consequence. Now, I will say in reality, I maybe don't do exactly every single mistake, but because sometimes I can sort of guess what that's going to be, but as much as possible, the more of these consequences that you can give them, or the more of the examples, the better off you are. So you can think about all of these questions for SMEs. sometimes the SMEs have a really hard time switching from talking about abstract principles to describing behaviors. And so if you ask about mistakes and consequences and they give you these broad answers, keep probing. And you may have to ask the questions a couple different ways. So you can use things like this of the what does it look like when they make the mistake? That's again that photo test from Julie Dirksen. So what does that consequence look like in practice? Maybe if you're thinking about a simulated conversation, which is fairly common for branching scenarios, maybe you're going to even see if the SME will role play a little bit with you of the, okay, I'll ask this, so you be the customer and I'll be the cashier and you do this. So you can sort of figure that out. So what if you can't get anything useful from the SME? If they are too busy, or if everything they give you is 1 or 2 word answers and everything is abstract rather than concrete, because I have for sure had that. So for whatever reason, if you get stuck with the SME, start writing something down. It does not matter if it's wrong. This is part of the thing. You do your research, review the existing training, read online articles or, whatever, but make your best guess and start writing it. Make guesses about consequences. I have never really gotten the SMEs to give me every single consequence in a neat and orderly fashion. I always end up guessing on some of it, and it's fine because the deal is it does not matter if it's wrong in this draft. Often when SMEs get stuck, it's because it's a blank page and because branching is so unfamiliar to them. If you put it in paper, if you put it in writing and give it to them, the SMEs cannot resist correcting you when you're wrong. This is one of the things that every SME I've ever worked with, if I make a guess in my branching scenario about what I think that conversation would look like, they'll come back, oh, no, they wouldn't, the customer wouldn't say this, they would say this instead. Or, oh, the patient wouldn't really say this, I've got a better example of this. In which case, I get the information that I was trying to get from them previously. No matter who your SME is, they won't let you get away with it being wrong. And so you'll get the thing. So don't be afraid if you don't get everything really cleanly, every single mistake, every single consequence. It's okay. Get started, make a reasonable guess, put something down. It is often easier for people to see once you get into the branching and you have a prototype. And that's one of the things that this process will help you do, is to get to that prototype. And I am watching the chat, so if there are other questions, feel free to jump in at any point. So at the end of doing these conversations with your SME and whatever stakeholders you're talking to, I write up a scenario, concept, and summary. So that's going to tell me the characters of the problem, sort of a rough outline of the ideal path, real high level at this point, and a list of mistakes. Potentially with some of those consequences that I've identified. So as an example, this would be the summary, where I've got the character and I've got her name. As much as possible in scenarios, we want to do names for characters and give them concrete details that makes them more memorable. So we have these names of these 2 main characters, Sophie and Robert. We know what her role is. We know what the problem is that she is facing. We know sort of what we're doing. I put this description in a design document when I'm doing the initial planning. Now, often when I do branching scenarios, it's a branching scenario in combination with something else. So I'll have my design document that has all of the other training, and then I'll have this as part of what we're going to say for in the branching scenario, here's the scenario concept. Then I have my outline or the ideal process. The ideal process would be what people would do if they made the best choice at each decision point. So this is my course on screening potential consulting clients. I have this process with 4 steps. Each of these steps is going to be a decision point in the scenario. Now, when I go to actually write the scenario, I might realize that I need to add another choice in here, but this gives me overall what the high level flow is going to be. Each one of these points is part of that repeatable process from my objective, and these are the places where people get stuck in the process. So I also have a list of mistakes. So based on that analysis, this is my conversation with SMEs. This is my list of mistakes, the errors. This list for me, I tend to keep this as a fairly fluid thing. I try to brainstorm a lot of mistakes and problems. I may not actually use everything, but I know where they are. I'll try to note what's a really critical one, something that really clearly ties to the learning objectives. Other ones might just be possible. When we're thinking about mistakes, it's also important to have the really big, major critical errors and some things that are maybe partially correct or in the gray area. So if you're going to have, you know, because when we do branching scenarios, often it is we'll have a choice that is good, a choice that is bad, and something that's maybe okay in the middle. It's partially correct. So thinking about those mistakes and possible choices, thinking through that now in the early analysis helps with the planning. You can also, if you want to be very organized with this, you could do some sort of table where you have the objectives, you have the mistakes, and you list out the consequences. And if this helps you get organized before doing the branching, then you could include something like this in your design document as well. So think about whatever format you do. I tend to be more fluid in mine, but if you're just getting started with branching scenarios and it's your first time doing it, or you haven't done it very much, something more structured may be more helpful in then getting you to that next step of writing. Are there any questions about this analysis and working with the SMEs before I move on to branching structures?
We don't have any questions in chat just yet, but yeah, if anybody has any questions, we'll just pause for a moment. This is really great information. Yeah, Megan, I agree. Fabulous info and applies to a lot of different things. I love the question list and really helpful.
Yeah, and Peter, I do think you're definitely right that those questions, that list of questions for SMEs, well, yes, I really drill into that heavily if I have branching scenarios. I use those same questions even when I'm doing other things, because I'll always have, you know, little mini scenarios or little examples of things where I want to know the mistakes and the things. So, and yes, this is a free PowerPoint template. I'll show you where you can get it at the end of the presentation. I've got the credits of where you can download this one. So at this point, I'd have my analysis that would go in the design document. So once everybody's agreed on that, then I would start writing. Now, for right now, I want to step back for a minute and think about the branching structures. So there's a number of things you can do to make your life easier in planning the structure itself. First of all, you only need 3 choices. There is research supporting using 3 choices for multiple choice questions. You don't need to do 4 choices. I know that most of us all learned to write 4 choices for multiple choice quizzes. The research says you don't need it for multiple choice quizzes. So even though that research that I'm citing here is not actually about branching scenarios, I think that it is not too much of a stretch to the research to say when we're doing branching scenarios, we also do not need to do more than 3. And in fact, sometimes you might just do 2 choices, because I would rather see 2 realistic choices than 2 realistic ones plus 1 ridiculous choice. And you may have decision points where maybe you have a branching scenario where most of them are 3 choices. But if you get to something and really there are only 2 options, it's the you do the thing or you don't do the thing, and those really are the only 2 choices, you can do maybe you do a 2. I think as Bridget says, there's the magic of 3s, and part of why I think 3 works really well in branching scenarios is that it gives you that the best choice, the worst choice, and that's something in the middle that's partially correct, or that's gray area, or that's the right choice but for a different point in the process. So I think that the 3 tends to work really well, because if you have no gray area, if there's nothing that's sort of that partially correct gray area, there's a question of whether a branching scenario is even the right thing. If everything's a very clear 2 choices all the way through, it's maybe not, you need to think about whether branching actually is the right thing. But yeah, Sarah, I think 2 is sometimes fine. I would not do 4, because it just gets too big too quickly. And if there's 2 gray areas, it may be unnecessarily harder. I guess it would depend on the skill and the level of the learners. If your audience is more experts and you're doing branching scenarios to work on very nuanced problem solving, you might actually have 2 gray areas. You could also have a branching scenario where there are 2 acceptable endings. It's just that they have different trade-offs. Sometimes project management can be that way. For example, maybe you decide that the time is really the most important thing, and so you spend more money to crash more resources on it, and that's a trade-off that you made. And so the ending is that yes, you meet the deadline, but you cost more money. Maybe you decide, however, maybe somebody else decides that the budget's more important, and so they're delayed. Either one of those is potentially the right answer. Kind of depends on the situation. So often when we see branching, it kind of looks like this structure, right? You have one thing, you have your 3 choices, each one of those leads out to 3 more choices, each one of those leads out to 3 more choices. This is sort of the traditional structure. There's no rejoining, there's no reusing choices. You lead to many, many numerous endings. In this example, the players make 3 total decisions. But so you've only gotten to 3 decisions, and this is already 40 screens. The number of screens in a time cave, this is called a time cave. It is broad, so you get to lots of possible endings, but it's very shallow. So you're generally limited to about a maximum of 3 decisions in each path. Just because from here it keeps growing exponentially and it just gets to be too big. Maybe you can go on a little longer if you make some of these, if everything that's a red at this point ends up being an ending and you just forcing a restart. But this structure for branching doesn't do as well for showing a longer process or for showing a change in a character, especially if you want to get some sort of emotional change in them. It's hard to do that in 3 decision points. And we know in my client screening, we know I've got 4 steps in my process. If I were to use a time cave like this, that 4th decision in the path is 81 more screens. So we're at 120 screens if you want to make 4 decisions in the process. That is ridiculous, and you shouldn't do it. I have done things with 15. I have one in my portfolio that has 15 endings. I still wouldn't recommend doing that. I think that's still too long, and I've tried to get better at consolidating things. So an alternative to the time cave is what's called the branch and bottleneck structure. So you branch into different options for a little while, but then all of the paths return to a single bottleneck. So that bottleneck is an event or choice that happens the same in every single path. So this example has 39 screens. So it's about the same number of screens as the time cave example on the last slide. But most of these paths are 6 decisions deep. There are 2 bottlenecks, but you can go up to a 6-step process in this. So this term of branch and bottleneck is from Sam Cobo Ashwell, and I've got some more on this on my blog for those interested. He was writing about structures for games and interactive fiction, but I think that branching scenarios effectively are interactive fiction. So this kind of structure can reflect the growth of a player character better. You may need to do some things managing states and variables so that if you made a really terrible decision, so let's say you made the terrible decision here, that maybe something is going to be a variable that is going to continue if you did end up, you got back to this bottleneck. In this case, a couple of these just end. If you've made 2 terrible decisions in a row, you're going to get a restart. So if you do, so in this case, in this one, you would do, if you did the yellow and then the red, in that case, that one's at a stop. And you would, then this one's giving you a restart. This is also part of what I do to manage the complexity, is that if you make a couple of wrong decisions in a row, you're going to either have to go back, and sometimes I will say this close to the beginning, I'd probably just have them restart the whole thing. Once we get down to this wrong answer, I might allow them to just, there's an argument for just going back 1 step and letting them repick rather than doing a restart all the way back to the beginning. But in some of these cases, we'll make a mistake, we'll get in here. So maybe there's something in this where the person's a little grumpy still with you. So after you get to this bottleneck and you do this, maybe, if there's some overall score that you would, if there's some overall score, like you're trying to motivate a patient to change their behavior, then that score is going to be affected by this. So Karen said you wouldn't restart at the recent black. So like if you made a wrong decision here, you would immediately send them back. Is that your question, Karen? Well, while I'm waiting for Karen.
I'm having mic problems, so I'm hoping you.
There you go. We hear you now.
Okay. Yes.
I have mic problems today, so I'm hoping you don't get feedback from me. If you make that error at that last red one that you've circled, I think I probably would have taken people back to that second black.
Ah, yes.
Instead of the very first black to start
Correct.
them over.
Yes, and so that would be another option too, is instead of having them, so there's a couple of things on this, of the how long you let people go down the wrong path, and are you going to make them restart all the way back to the beginning, or are you going to restart to a bottleneck point like this? Like, I mean, if you've gotten all the way through the scenario to this point, you're going to be kind of annoyed if you're all the way back to here. You probably are going to be a lot happier if you go back to here. And those bottleneck points also make it really nice to have some places to jump back at. It's not quite your spawn point in a game, but it is a good point to jump back to. So yes, Karen, I that is, I think, a good thing. And so Bridget asked how often I use these as final assessments or quizzes versus test and learns. It depends on the client and what they are looking for. I will say, just through the vagaries of how working independently is, I have ended up with, in the last few years, doing a lot of continuing professional development things where they're lots more interested in the practice piece of it, and nobody's really looking at an assessment where they get credit as long as they've finished it, and completion is what they're looking for. So all they're worried about is practice, and I'm not assessing where I have to prove that people got an 80% score. But I think there's arguments, you can use branching either way. It is, for me, often been that I do some combination of some direct instruction with presentations, some mini scenarios, sort of the one question mini scenarios throughout, kind of interspersed, and then for maybe individual skills out of this, and then combine it all together in a comprehensive practice with a branching scenario at the end. That structure I've seen work out pretty well, but it kind of depends on what the objectives are. So here's an example of one. Now, of course, I had that lovely graphic where everything's color-coded. And then, oh yeah, and Mel, yeah, excellent point. You can attach a point value to their answers for the first two sections, have that determine the message they get in the last branch. You could have some sort of, you could also do variables. So maybe at the end you get feedback messages that said, at this step you did this, and at this step you did this, and at this step you did this. So if you had variables and controlled those things, then you could do customized feedback based on their decisions all the way through at the end. So yes. And again, I think the bottleneck structure makes that a little easier. In this case, now this one's a lot more complicated because there's a lot of crossing back and forth. But this one here in yellow, this one is a bottleneck. Everything else, if it's wrong, ends up being a restart. And so in this case, this one isn't a huge branching scenario, but I do have this one bottleneck at the end, because the only things that you're going to do before you get to the end, you've got to get to this particular one. And you can see that there's 3 different paths that potentially lead to this. Depends on what people do. So there are some different ways to do this. And so, yeah, Patty's talking about doing a score where you could do a level based on how much they got. And so, yeah, you could score some of this. And again, the bottlenecks make it easier to have some of these sorts of divisions. This one, you could see that there's a lot of things. You can see that a lot of these things go back to, this is my start screen. And you can see that there's a lot of arrows pointing to this. That's because those are failures where things go back to that restart. Leslie, the tool to map this out is called Twine, and that's going to be in the next session of the presentation. That's what this is a screenshot from. So in this case, that ideal decision was, I think, 4 decisions deep. And so mostly these, there's a lot of this where the paths are crossing and converging. This ended up being 20 slides in Storyline, but that's a 1/6 of the number of slides it would have taken to do the full time cave structure. So yes, this is a little messy, possibly a lot messy, but a lot more manageable to build once I get it to Storyline or whatever tool you're going to do than it would be if you did that full time cave where everything grows exponentially. So another way to reduce the complexity is by using cutscenes. So in a video game, a cutscene is a short, non-interactive scene that cuts away from the action. So you can move the plot forward, show the conversation, build emotion. And so we can borrow this technique from video game design to develop branching scenarios for learning. So in a simulated conversation, sometimes when I see people building branching scenarios, I see them try to make every single piece of the dialogue its own decision. And so if you're controlling a character, then every single sentence almost that comes out of that character's mouth is another decision point. And all of a sudden it blows up and you've got 80 slides. And it becomes totally unmanageable. So instead of doing that, I had gone through before. I knew where I had my steps. I knew where people got stuck. There's a bunch more conversation that has to go through in this client screening, but I don't have to, I want to show that, but I don't have to have them make a decision for every single question. So I'm going to stop the share for just a second here. And bring up an example so you can see what this is. So this is this conversation, and it's going to go on. There's a bunch of dialogue back and forth. And all I have in here, this is just a bunch of layers in a single slide, and we could do a continue. And so we have this conversation, but this is my cutscene. I'm just going to let them go through this and talk about it. And then get to a decision point. Rather than trying, this could have been 5 different decision points, all of which then needed to have wrong choices and consequences. And just this little piece of the conversation would have been another 15 slides or 20. And I don't want to do that. So this is that cutscene in order to make this more manageable. Another way that you can help manage how many slides you have to build is to have the opportunities to fix mistakes. So this was sort of, we were kind of getting into this too on earlier when we were talking about that, you know, sometimes, you know, you make a couple of big errors, maybe you're going to just fail. In this case, let's say in the first decision, you make totally the wrong choice. But I'm then going to give you an opportunity to at least make an okay choice. In this one, the green is the best choices, the red is the worst choices, this yellow orange is the ones that are kind of partially correct. So maybe, just like in a conversation, if you say something wrong in a real conversation, you have an opportunity to maybe soothe tempers a little bit, or to go back and ask a better question. You know, you asked that really poor question at the beginning. Well, now you've got the opportunity to do something better. So if you'll notice, so if you make the best choice, you've got a good bad, and an okay choice. The okay choice, the next level, overlaps to some extent. One of your options is to go back and make the choice that you were supposed to make the last time. So you can reuse some of these choices and use these slides multiple times, and that also makes it easier to build. So let's talk about Twine. Patty's already put this link in the chat. This is where you would download this. This is a free online open source tool. You can use it online, but I do the download version. It's designed for interactive nonlinear stories and games, but that means it works really well for nonlinear branching scenarios. And once again, I'm going to come in here and open up Twine so that you can see this. So this is what it looks like. So I give it a name, I get started, and you can see I can just type in here, and I'm going to say, here's the so to make a choice, as Mel said, it's really easy once you get the hang of how to link the boxes. And let me show you how easy this is. So I'm doing these double brackets. And it automatically has made these other three choices for me. Twine publishes to an HTML file, and so you can load it, you can publish it and load it to any place that you could put an HTML file and share it. And this actually gives you a functional prototype. So I just clicked play, and then this would give me my choices. I don't have anything in here right now. It'll give me, I can go back. But you can see that it's pretty easy to do this, and you give them that functional prototype. And again, where we talked about getting stuck with SMEs earlier, where sometimes a SME just cannot get it until you can show them something to click through. And I often find that SMEs, before I discovered Twine, I had tried doing things in PowerPoint or in Word documents and having flowcharts and things, and I had at best mixed results getting SMEs to follow along. Because especially SMEs who have never heard of Choose Your Own Adventure books or have never done any sort, have never played video games, have never done any of this, that they can really struggle to just wrap their brains around having something that is not linear. It can be really difficult for people to understand. You show them this and they're like, oh, now I understand what you meant. And they get it. And Danny noted that you can do branch track with and look at the free version. Branch track is really fast to make the branching scenarios. Their full version I find to be a little pricey unless you're doing lots of branching scenarios, but it's really good at what it does. So this is, so you can see that this would be here, and I could just keep going through here. You can also, so you would publish to a file, and that's going to give you that HTML file. You can view a proofing copy, which I've got mine set up right now so that it'll give me just a text version as I'm using a plugin. This will just give me a plain text version of everything. And so all of this is just plain text. So when I give this to SMEs for review, what I find is I give them the prototype so that they can click through it. And I encourage them to try clicking through multiple paths before they start doing feedback. And then I give them a text version that I've given them in Word, so that if they need to make actual changes to the script or to the responses or whatever, that then they can make that in Word with track changes on. And the combination of the two is probably that's going to be the better option. Marianne, the color block branching structures, those are all just in PowerPoint. Those are images that I have created to show things on my blog and in the presentation, because I think it's easier to see with that very simplified version of it. But in real life, when I'm working with it, this is what I do, is twine. I might clean up some of these things of, having the choice of, having, instead of the double colons in advance, if I move it into Word, I'd probably make that an actual title or bold it or something, put it on different screens so they can figure it out. But in general, this process has worked really well for me in terms of getting the feedback from the SMEs and getting them to understand what it is. It's still not perfect. I have still had SMEs, when I show a wrong choice, the last one of these I did for things, I had 2 different comments on wrong choices where it's like, oh, but this is the wrong thing and you should actually do this other thing. It's like, yes, exactly, correct. That's the mistake and I'm trying to show the mistake. So sometimes you still are going to have to walk through it with some SMEs. If you get somebody who's still super linear and doesn't quite understand it. But this has been better than anything else. And the getting SME feedback part of branching scenarios has always been kind of a stumbling block. So you did all your analysis and planning earlier. You've got your summary, your outline, your list of mistakes. You've installed Twine on your computer. You have some ideas about your structure from what you've got all those branching structures kind of in the back of your head of how you can do this. So where do you start? One of the options is to write one full decision point with all of the consequences first. This is Kathy Moore's recommended strategy. This is, I think, especially important if you have a really large scenario. If this is going to be something that's over 50 slides, do this one decision point first. If your clients have never done branching scenarios before, doing one decision point with all of those consequences is probably useful to make sure that they get that tone right. And you can use Twine for that. And if you were going to do things like we were talking about points earlier, you could just sort of make text notes of, give 10 points, plus 10 points, minus 5 points, whatever your scoring things would be, and just sort of make them text notes in Twine. There are ways to do variables and to make things functional, even with scoring in Twine. If you are interested in doing JavaScript and you can do some more formatting in CSS too. But I don't think you need to for this, just getting a prototype. And in fact, having it just plain text often is better to get clients to focus on the content, which is what you really want. So the other option besides doing that one decision point, if the scenario isn't very big, I've done a couple that are, maybe 15, 16 screens total. And I have one client who I've done several branching scenarios for. We've done branching video scenarios for several things. They're familiar with how it works. I don't do the one decision point for them. So I just start writing because they won't see it until we get to the point of having a complete prototype of the scenario, because it's only 15 screens or so. So in that case, I create that ideal path first. Sometimes you sit down to write the branching and it's just overwhelming because there's so many different ways to go. Focus on writing one path from start to finish. I find that gives me better continuity. So I write that that first choice. So screens means slide. Yeah, I would generally say a screen is going to be a slide. In Twine, it's called a passage. And I would say generally each passage generally correlates to one slide in Storyline or Captivate. You could possibly have things with layers that you do it a little bit differently. But each decision point, I find it's a little trickier if I'm reusing screens to do it with layers. So screen equals passage equals slide, roughly. Yeah, I'm kind of using them interchangeably here. That's a good point for clarification, John. Thanks. So we would do this. So we're going to do this ideal path. So have I ever provided only wrong and weak answers to choose from on purpose to get the learner in the thick of trouble? I would say I would probably use a cutscene or some other change in the scenario in order to drop them in the thick of trouble, rather than forcing them into a wrong path. I don't like forcing people and guiding them too much to the right path, but I also probably wouldn't guide them too much to the wrong path. But Mike, that's an interesting idea, and there might be a situation where that would make sense, especially if you're doing the branching scenario at the beginning of things. Maybe you do a branching at the beginning of the scenario of the training and show them how terrible it could be. So sometimes there's no right answer. And so you could have something where there's no right answer. You could have things where there's two answers that just both have trade-offs. So when I write this, now, if you're less experienced with branching scenarios, what you may do in Twine is create each passage in Twine for each of those steps of the right answers, the best answers in each thing. I tend to sort of skip that step, but that is somewhat because I'm a SME in branching scenarios, and like most SMEs, I skip some of the steps. So if you're doing your first one, you maybe put the plot points first and then fill in the script. I also just sort of find that the script sometimes leads me down different paths than I would otherwise get. So here's what I'd maybe do in Twine. I'd write out my first decision, and then I've got, okay, these are my three things. I know I've got my right one. In this case, I know that one of those wrong choices is going to be to send a price estimate, and then I'm going to have some other okay choice, and I don't know what that is yet. But for purposes of drafting this ideal path, I'm just going to leave a placeholder for that. An okay choice. So I knew that I had that process with 4 steps, and the first step is that they're supposed to send some screening questions. So then from there, I write the second decision that is the response, the consequence from that first good decision. So here's that response. Again, I've got some placeholders. I'll note for myself there's an okay choice, there's a bad choice. That helps me when I come back later. So my initial draft, I literally go through start to finish on one whole path. In this case, here's what that ideal path looks like. And Patty's got an example here of where all of these other choices are eventually going to lead, what I would guess probably is, no matter which of these other choices they do, that there's a bottleneck for you have to call the employee hotline. All of those other things, so the procedure is you try those other things first, and then you then call the employee hotline, and that one's probably a bottleneck. That would probably be the structure that makes sense, because there's a couple of other things, but ultimately you're going to have to get to that. This is what that ideal path sort of looks like. I've got my placeholders for where I'm going to put other things in, but I don't know quite what all of them are going to be yet. And then for my own process, just to be systematic about it, I tend to go back to the beginning and pick a bad choice or an okay choice, pick one choice, and then start fleshing that out. So as you're writing those mistakes and consequences, then you're going to think about the structures that I talked about earlier. So maybe there's a bottleneck, like what Patty was describing. Sounds like that's something where I would have in my mind, okay, this one's going to be a bottleneck at this particular choice. Thinking about when do people have opportunities to correct mistakes, and when are the mistakes so critical that it really should force a restart, or it should force them to go back to some other bottleneck or some other point. And thinking through that as I'm writing the mistakes. And then this is going to give you that prototype in Twine. So this is what it'll look like. I'm not going to pull that up, but it'll be on my blog because I know we're down to 3 minutes left. The good news is I am down to, this is my contact info. I'm actually going to put this credits up just very briefly here because there was some comments on the slide templates. The template is named Juliet. It's available for free on Slides Carnival. And I will put my contact info up here too. I know I've only got 2 minutes left, but what other questions do you have for me?
I know people loved this presentation. Lots of really great information.
If you don't have a question, could you put in chat what is one thing that you think you're going to be able to go back and apply?
That's a really good one. Yeah.
Having that structured process for doing it. Doing 3 choices. Yeah, that research has been, that was really popular in Slack when I shared that a couple of weeks ago. Yep, Twine, doing the 3 options. The client questions, that scenario is on my blog, so you can see. I've actually got basically step-by-step how I built that whole scenario in a series of blog posts. So the visual structure, testing of the tool, yep. Yeah, that cutscene where it was the back and forth dialogue, that is one slide with a bunch of layers. Because I just wanted to move the plot along until I don't need them to make a decision for every part of that. So the cutscenes are, again, one of those that that's one of those that does just save a bunch of time. And yes,
and
getting
then
the
just to
SMEs
let
to
everybody
correct you.
know, I'll be posting this video up on Slack, either likely today, if not tomorrow.
Good. All right.
Oh my gosh, Christy, that was really good. Could you just one more time cutscene define that for Mike there?
Oh yes. So sorry, my screen got lagged for a second. So in cutscenes, in video games, a cutscene is the one that where you jump away from the action for a little bit. So in that conversation, that's from out of the middle of a branching scenario where they do a bunch of decision points, but then I let the 2 characters just talk for a while, and I cut away from the action a little bit and just do it, and just had them watch this passively while click and continue. That still counts as passive in my book. Does that help, Mike?
Yeah. Perfect.
Great.
All right, we are at the top of the hour, so we will hop off. But like I said, I'll post this. Thank you so much, Christy. I think we all got a ton out of this, and I think people are going to love this at the upcoming conference. So really, really incredible job. I mean, it's packed full of awesome nuggets. So.
Well, thank you all for being here today and asking good questions and letting me go a minute past time. And yes, I will be doing this again at the Learning Solutions Conference in Orlando in a couple of weeks. This is you all are my my practice run for that conference. So thanks for being my guinea pigs to let me try it out.
Thanks for letting us take a sneak peek. Have a great rest of your week, everyone. See you guys on Slack. We'll meet again on Thursday, March 19th. That'll be a community hour where we'll all just have a chat. But thanks again for presenting, Christy. Have a good rest of your weeks, everybody on Slack.